Okay, so you know how it is. It's the holidays, right? You're surrounded by all these images of like picture-perfect families and all these festive gatherings. But for a lot of people, the reality is it's not quite like that Hallmark movie. For many people, the holidays can actually be a really lonely time.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of a weird contrast, isn't it? Like this time of year that's supposed to be all about togetherness can actually make those feelings of isolation even stronger for a lot of folks.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to really dive into today. We've got a few different sources to help us unpack all of this. Tips from mental health first aid, some research on the actual health impacts of feeling lonely, and then we'll touch on some advice from a psychotherapist, Joyce Martyr, on Psych Central.
Yeah, that's a really great mix of resources to get a good picture of what loneliness really is, especially during the holidays.
For sure. So I think the first thing we need to do is just acknowledge that loneliness during the holidays, it's more common than a lot of people think. Even before the pandemic kind of shook things up, the Canadian census showed that something like 14% of people over 15 were living alone. And, probably safe to say that that number has probably gone up since then.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the most important things to remember is that loneliness isn't just about physically being alone. You can be surrounded by people at a party, a family dinner, and still feel totally disconnected.
It's almost like you're invisible, even though you're in a room full of people.
Yeah, exactly. It's about that feeling of disconnection more than anything else. And sometimes that feeling, it goes even deeper than just what's happening around you right now. It can be tied to things from your past, maybe traumas, or even those deep insecurities we all carry around.
So it's not as easy as just like, oh, go join a club or go to more party.
Yeah, it's definitely not that simple. In fact, for some people, being in those social situations can actually make those feelings of loneliness even worse. They might go to a party hoping to feel connected, but then they end up feeling even more isolated when those conversations feel forced or just really superficial.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've definitely been there, where you're going through the motions of being social, but you're not really connecting on a deeper level. It can almost make you feel lonelier than if you just stayed home.
Exactly. And this is where that idea of chronic loneliness comes in. This is when that feeling of isolation just kind of sticks around. It becomes like a default setting almost. And a lot of times it's rooted in some deeper psychological stuff.
So it's more than just like feeling a little sad or missing a friend. It's this kind of constant feeling of being disconnected that affects how you see yourself and even the world around you.
That's a great way to put it. It's almost like those past experiences, whether it's something from childhood or difficult relationships, or even just like a pattern of feeling like you're not being seen or heard. They create this lens that you see everything through.
It makes sense, right? If you've been hurt or let down before, it makes it so much harder to open yourself up to new connections, even if people are genuinely trying to be kind.
Exactly. It's like a way of protecting yourself, right? You're shielding yourself from being hurt again. But the problem is it can also keep you stuck in that cycle of being isolated.
So it's not that people who experience chronic loneliness don't want connection.
Yeah.
It's that there's something blocking them from really experiencing it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand that psychology piece of it. Because if we just say, oh, you just need to find more friends, we're totally missing the point.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. You're not actually addressing the problem.
Perfect analogy. And one of the things that's so interesting about the research on loneliness is that it shows just how much this emotional state can actually impact our physical health.
So wait, loneliness can actually affect our bodies, not just our moods.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. One study actually found that chronic loneliness can be twice as harmful to our physical and mental health as obesity.
Wow, twice as harmful as obesity. That's like a really big deal. It really makes you realize that this is a serious health concern, not just like a case of the blues.
Exactly. And the research is very clear on this. Chronic loneliness is linked to a higher risk of heart disease, a weaker immune system, problems sleeping, and even cognitive decline.
Wait, cognitive decline? So loneliness can actually affect how we think and remember things.
It can. You see, when we're chronically lonely, our bodies are basically in this constant state of stress. And that stress releases hormones like cortisol, which, if it's happening all the time, can be bad for brain function. Like, your brain is a muscle, and if it's constantly being bombarded with these stress hormones, it can't perform at its best.
So it's not just feeling mentally exhausted. Loneliness can actually wear down our bodies.
Exactly. It affects the whole system. It's definitely something we should be taking seriously.
Okay, so we're starting to get a better understanding of just how big of a deal loneliness really is. But to really tackle it, we need to understand where it comes from. What are some of the things you see in people who are struggling with this, especially that chronic loneliness that just doesn't seem to go away?
Well, a really common trigger is any kind of major life change. Think about it. Losing someone you love, going through a divorce, even moving to a new city, these can all really disrupt your social connections and make you feel lost.
That makes total sense. It's like your whole support system gets shaken up and you don't really know where to turn.
Yeah, it's a great way to describe it. And in the mental health world, we often call this reactive loneliness. It's a natural response to losing someone or having your support system disrupted.
So it's not necessarily a sign that there's something wrong with you, it's just a reaction to a tough situation.
Exactly. And usually this kind of loneliness fades as you adapt to the changes and build new connections. But for some people, those feelings of isolation stick around even after those initial challenges have passed.
And that's when it turns into chronic loneliness, right?
Right. And there are a few things that can contribute to that more long-term type of loneliness. Sometimes it's related to those deeper psychological things we talked about earlier, like traumas from the past, insecurities, or even certain personality traits that can make it harder to build and keep close relationships.
It's like the past experiences create a blueprint for how you interact with everyone. And if that blueprint is based on being hurt or rejected, it can be really tough to break free from those patterns.
I like that, a blueprint. And then there are also things happening in society that can make loneliness worse, especially for certain groups of people. Like older adults who might be dealing with physical limitations or the loss of people close to them, or people with disabilities who face barriers to being included socially, or even just people who live in communities where people aren't really connected.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we can't forget about technology, right? It can be a great way to stay in touch with people, but it can also make people feel more isolated if they're spending more time on screens than they are with real people.
Totally. And that was a huge issue during the pandemic when everyone was basically forced to connect online. Technology can be a good bridge sometimes, but it just can't replace being with someone face to face.
Yeah, it's like trying to satisfy your hunger by looking at a picture of a delicious meal. It might look good, but it's not actually going to give you any nourishment.
That's such a good way to put it. And I think it highlights the fact that loneliness is a complicated issue with a lot of layers. It's not always easy to figure out exactly where it's coming from, and there's not one solution that works for everyone. But the good news is there are things we can do to deal with those feelings of isolation and build more meaningful connections in our lives.
And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to look at some practical tips and strategies for overcoming loneliness, from strengthening your social connections to developing a deeper sense of self-compassion. So stay tuned.
Because even though loneliness can feel incredibly isolating, it's so important to remember that you are not alone in this. And there is always hope for finding greater connection and belonging in your life.
So, there's something that really struck me when we were prepping for this deep dive was it's this idea that loneliness isn't always about physically being alone.
Right.
Like you could be surrounded by people, maybe even at a big holiday dinner or a party, and still feel totally disconnected.
Yeah, it's that internal feeling of loneliness, right? It's like that sense that you don't belong or that your connections aren't really meaningful. And that can be so strong even when you're in a crowd.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a key point because it means that, dealing with loneliness, it's not just about I need to be around more people.
It's not that simple.
It's not just about quantity, it's about quality.
Yeah, exactly. You could have thousands of followers online, but still feel super lonely if those interactions don't really mean anything,
Right.
Or you could be part of a big family, but if those relationships feel strained or superficial, you can still feel isolated.
It's like you're surrounded by people, but you still feel invisible.
Like no one really sees you.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to understand the psychology behind loneliness, because if we just think of it as a numbers game or just changing our circumstances, we're missing a big part of the puzzle. It's not just about changing what's going on around you.
Right.
It's about understanding maybe how your past experiences or your thoughts or even your beliefs about yourself might be playing a role.
Definitely. And one of the things that Joyce Marter, the psychotherapist we mentioned, talks about is this idea that chronic loneliness is often connected to deeper issues like, past traumas or maybe a lack of self-worth.
It's like those past experiences, they kind of create a filter that you see your current relationships through. And it makes it harder to feel truly connected, even when people are genuinely trying to reach out to you,
Yeah.
it's almost like you're expecting to be hurt or rejected.
Right, so you end up sabotaging those connections before they even have a chance.
Yeah, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure almost.
Exactly. And, a lot of it comes down to that feeling of not being good enough or not deserving love.
Right.
Even if someone compliments you or asks you to hang out, there's this voice in your head that's like, they don't really mean it, or I don't deserve this.
And that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Absolutely.
Like if you're always expecting to be rejected, you might unconsciously push people away, and then that just confirms your belief that you're not worthy of love or connection.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And that's why self-compassion is so crucial when it comes to overcoming loneliness.
Oh yeah, we touched on that a bit in the last part.
Yeah.
And it's such an important concept. It's about, treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to a close friend. So instead of beating yourself up for feeling lonely, you try to acknowledge those feelings with gentleness. You remind yourself that you are worthy of love and connection, regardless of your past.
Yeah, it's a big shift in perspective, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when you can start to be more compassionate toward yourself, it can really help quiet that inner critic and create space for more positive beliefs about yourself and your relationships.
It's like becoming your own best friend, offering yourself that same kind of warmth and encouragement that you would give to someone you care about.
Yeah.
And it's not about pretending everything's perfect or denying those negative feelings. It's about accepting those emotions and understanding them.
That's so important. It's not about ignoring those tough emotions. It's about acknowledging them,
Yeah.
validating them, and then choosing to respond to them in a kind and supportive way rather than being critical or judgmental.
It's like saying to yourself, hey, it's okay that I feel this way. I'm not alone, and there's nothing wrong with me. Let's figure this out together.
I love that. And it's a much more empowering approach than just getting stuck in that cycle of blaming yourself and feeling isolated. It's about recognizing that we all have those moments of self-doubt and insecurity, but we don't have to let them control our lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one thing that really resonated with me from the Mental Health First Aid Guide was that, quote, you were not alone.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's such a simple statement, but it's so powerful when you're feeling lost and disconnected.
It reminds us that even when things feel really dark, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of reaching out and finding connection. And sometimes that connection starts with ourselves,
Absolutely. And that leads to another interesting point that our sources touch on. It's this idea that sometimes loneliness can actually be a sign that you're not in the right social circle.
Yes. They actually use the phrase questioning your social group, which might sound a little harsh. But it's not about blaming other people for your loneliness. It's about taking a look at your relationships and asking yourself, are these people really supportive? Are they good for me?
Because sometimes you can feel the loneliest when you're surrounded by people who don't really get you.
Right, exactly.
Or who don't appreciate you for who you are.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You can force it, but it's never going to be comfortable.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, especially during the holidays. You might feel obligated to go to certain events or spend time with certain people, even if it doesn't really make you feel good.
Absolutely. It's so common, especially if those relationships are based on obligation or family history rather than a real connection.
That's like you're just playing a role, not being your authentic self.
Exactly. And that can be really isolating, even if you're physically with other people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So it's not about like cutting people out of your life or being judgmental. It's about recognizing that sometimes to find genuine connection, you need to be more selective about who you spend your time with.
I like that, being more selective. It's about prioritizing your own well-being and making choices that support your emotional health.
And sometimes that means creating a little distance from people who are consistently negative or draining.
Even if it's family or people you've known a long time.
It can be a tough decision, but it's important to remember that you deserve to be around people who make you feel good, who see you and value you.
Exactly. And sometimes letting go of relationships that aren't serving you anymore, even if it's hard, can open up space for new, healthier connections.
I love that, creating space for new connections. Because it's not about shutting yourself off from the world. It's about being intentional about who you let into your life and making sure that those relationships are both supportive and reciprocal.
It's like tending a garden. Sometimes you got to prune back the dead branches to let the healthy plants grow.
That's such a great metaphor. And it reminds us that building a fulfilling social life, It's not something that happens overnight.
Right.
It's an ongoing process, right? It takes effort, it takes intention, and it takes a willingness to be honest with yourself about what you need and what you deserve.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it all goes back to that self-compassion piece,
Absolutely.
When you can be kind to yourself, when you recognize your own worth, it's so much easier to set boundaries and make choices that support your well-being.
And it makes it easier to ask for help when you need it too. Because sometimes, even when you're doing all the right things, taking care of yourself, working on those relationships, practicing self-compassion, those feelings of loneliness can still stick around. And that's when it's really important to remember that you don't have to go through this alone.
Yeah, absolutely. There is zero shame in reaching out for professional support. In fact, it's a sign of strength to recognize when you need some extra help. Therapists are trained to help people figure out where that loneliness is coming from, develop healthy coping skills, and build stronger, more fulfilling relationships.
Right. And I think it's important to say that therapy isn't just for people who are in crisis or who have a serious mental health diagnosis.
Yeah.
It can be helpful for anyone who is struggling with any kind of emotional challenge, and that includes loneliness.
Absolutely. It's about having a safe space to explore your feelings, learn coping skills, and just understand yourself and your relationships better.
Like having a guide to help you navigate those tough emotional times and find your way back to a place of connection and joy.
Right.
And even if therapy isn't an option right now, there are other resources out there,
Yeah, for sure.
support groups, online communities, even just reaching out to a trusted friend or family member.
It's about remembering that you're not meant to do this alone, especially when things are tough. There are people who want to help, and you don't have to suffer in silence.
That's such a powerful message. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back to wrap up this deep dive and talk about how we can all move forward with greater connection and self-compassion. So welcome back to the deep dive. It's been kind of heavy, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what loneliness feels like, especially during a time of year when you're supposed to be all cheerful and everything.
Yeah, it's a tough topic for sure. But one thing that's really stood out to me from all these sources is this: loneliness. It's not like a permanent condition. It's not a life sentence. There are things you can do about it.
Definitely. And we've talked about a lot already, right? The different types of loneliness, where it comes from psychologically, practical steps people can take, when to get professional help. But I'm curious, for people listening who's really connecting with this stuff, how do they go from just getting through the holidays to actually enjoying them, even if they're feeling that loneliness?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of it goes back to what we were saying before about self-compassion and expectations.
So instead of beating ourselves up for not feeling perfectly happy,
Right.
we've got to cut ourselves some slack.
Exactly. The holidays, they bring up so much, nostalgia, all those shoulds and supposed tos. It's easy to start comparing yourself to past holidays or other people's seemingly perfect celebrations you see online, all that.
It's that whole Hallmark movie thing again, right?
Yeah. We expect our lives to match up to this idealized version of reality.
And when it doesn't, it just makes you feel worse.
Totally. But what if, instead of focusing on what we think the holidays should be, we focused on what they can be right now, in this moment, even with all the imperfections?
Okay, I'm liking this. So it's about accepting where we are, not where we think we should be.
And that acceptance, I think, is where you can find real joy. Maybe it's not the picture-perfect family gathering, but maybe it's a phone call with a friend where you really connect,
Right?
Or taking time for a hobby that you love, or even just letting yourself rest and recharge without feeling guilty.
It's about those small moments, those genuine connections, whether it's with yourself or with others, that can make all the difference.
And those moments can happen anytime, not just during the holidays, which I think is really important. It reminds us that dealing with loneliness, it's not a seasonal thing, It's an ongoing process.
So it's about weaving those strategies into your everyday life, connecting with people, acts of service, self-care, even seeking help when you need it.
Exactly. It's about building a life that has connection and meaning built into it, no matter what time of year it is. And let's be real, it's not always easy, Some days, some weeks even, that loneliness is going to feel heavier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's when we have to remember all the stuff we've been talking about. Be kind to ourselves, challenge those negative thoughts, and reach out for support if we need it.
And remember, asking for help is not a weakness. It's a sign of strength. There's no shame in reaching out to loved ones, to a therapist, or even to online communities. You're not alone in this.
So important to remember that. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. Loneliness. It's a human experience. It happens to a lot of us. It can be because of past stuff, unrealistic expectations, all kinds of things. But it doesn't have to control you.
We have the power to change how we deal with those feelings, to build connections that matter, and to create that sense of belonging, not just during the holidays, but all year round.
Love that. So listeners, what really resonated with you today? What's one small step you can take to feel more connected, to combat that loneliness in your own life? Maybe it's calling a friend, volunteering somewhere, or just taking a few minutes to be kind to yourself.
Even small things can make a big difference over time.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, take care.